For 18 years, I lived with the pain of having to give up my baby boy for adoption. I was young, single, and my family pressured me into it, promising me that he would be placed in a loving home and that he might reach out when he turned 18. But when his 18th birthday came and went with no word, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Determined to find answers, I reached out to the hospital, but what I discovered left me horrified and furious. I remember that day vividly, 18 years ago. As I held my newborn baby boy for the first time, tears filled my eyes. His tiny fingers wrapped around mine, his soft cries echoing in the sterile hospital room. I glanced up, hoping for some semblance of support, but found none. The nurse was sympathetic but helpless, and my heart felt like it was breaking apart with each breath. My parents stood in the corner, their expressions cold and unsupportive, as I pleaded with them to let me keep him. "Please, Mom. Please, Dad. I can do this," I begged, my voice cracking. Mom crossed her arms and glanced at Dad, who shook his head firmly. "It's for the best," Dad said. "You're too young, and you can't do it alone." Their words felt like knives to my heart. Despite my desperate pleas, they insisted I give him up for adoption, citing my youth and single status. "You'll thank us later," my mother said, trying to convince me it was the right thing to do. I felt trapped, suffocated by their words. The doctor entered the room with the adoption papers, and I could hardly see through my tears. "It's the best for the baby," the doctor said, trying to reassure me. When the doctor confirmed that the papers were final, my heart shattered into pieces and tears streamed down my face. "No, please don't take him away," I sobbed, clutching my son tightly. But the nurse gently pried him from my arms, and the reality set in. My baby, my precious boy, was being taken away from me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. My parents walked out of the room, leaving me desolate and broken. The image of my baby wrapped in linen, crying as they took him away, is forever burned into my memory. I watched helplessly as the nurse carried him out of the room, his cries growing fainter with each step. I felt a gaping hole in my heart, an emptiness that nothing could ever fill. I tried to stand, but my legs buckled beneath me. All I could do was curl into a ball and weep uncontrollably. The next few weeks were a blur of sorrow and emptiness. I often found myself wandering into what would have been his nursery. I would sit in the rocking chair, staring at the empty crib, my heart aching for the baby I lost. Each night, I cried myself to sleep, haunted by the sound of his cries. My parents ignored my pain, believing I would eventually move on. Longing to hold him again, my parents tried to justify their decision, claiming it was for the best. "You'll see, dear, he'll have a better life," Mom would say, but her words felt empty. Dad chimed in, telling me how I'd have opportunities to build a future of my own. But every time they spoke, it felt like a cruel reminder of what I had lost. I could hardly bear to look at them. Despite their assurances, I felt an unending ache that only grew over the years as I clung to the hope he'd reach out. Each passing year was a constant reminder of my loss. I tried to distract myself with school, work, and friends, but the void never left. Every baby I saw, every mother with her child, brought back the pain. I kept wondering if he was doing well, if he was happy, if he was even alive. I created an album with the few keepsakes I had, dreaming of showing him one day. I filled it with pictures of his nursery, tiny handprints, and the outfit he wore when he was born. I wrote letters to him, hoping he'd read them someday. "Dear son," I started each letter, pouring out my heart. Despite the years, I never stopped longing for the moment we'd be reunited, and that hope kept me going. Every moment was filled with the unfulfilled promise that I might hear from him when he turned 18. It was the only thread of hope I held on to. I envisioned him growing up, becoming curious, and eventually wanting to find me. It was a fragile hope, but it was enough to keep the dream alive. I couldn't imagine the possibility that he might never seek me out. That hope sustained me through the years, but the ache remained persistent and unwavering. No matter how much time passed, the pain never dulled. Every milestone, every birthday, was a reminder of what could have been. The longing never lessened, and it felt as if my heart was constantly tugging towards him. That small glimmer of hope was all that stood between me and utter despair. As the years went by, I tried to move on with my life, graduating from college and starting a career. I threw myself into my studies, hoping that academic success would somewhat fill the void. Later, I found a job that kept me busy, giving me a sense of purpose. My colleagues never knew about the pain I carried with me as I put on a brave face every day. Every year on his birthday, I would light a candle and say a prayer, hoping he was safe and loved. It became a ritual, a moment of connection with the son I never got to raise. I imagined what he might look like, how he might be celebrating. Those quiet moments alone with the candlelight were both comforting and heartbreaking, a way to reach out across the years and miles. I eventually married and had other children, but my firstborn always occupied a special place in my heart. My new family brought joy and love into my life, and I cherished every moment with them. Still, there was an empty seat at our table, a shadow that lingered in the background. My husband and children knew about my firstborn, and they showed me unwavering support and understanding. My husband and kids knew about him, and they sympathized with my grief. They listened patiently to my stories and held me when the pain became too much to bear. My youngest once asked, "Will we ever meet him, Mommy?" I could only smile sadly and say, "I hope so, sweetie." Their love gave me the strength to keep moving forward, despite the ache that never left. My belief in the idea that he might reach out kept me going, hoping his 18th birthday would finally bring contact. I had always imagined what that day would be like, the phone call, the reunion, the tears of joy. It was a dream that sustained me through dark times and gave me something to look forward to. Each year, that hope grew stronger, as if my soul knew our reunion was inevitable. Despite building a new life, the void of my missing child never truly left me. It was a constant undercurrent, a whisper in the back of my mind. I could be laughing with my family one moment and, in the next, be caught off guard by a memory of him. My other children filled my heart with joy, but they couldn't erase the part of me that longed for my firstborn. His 18th birthday arrived, and I stayed home all day, glued to the phone and checking my email constantly. My heart raced with every notification, every ring. I didn't dare leave the house, fearful I might miss his call or message. I repeated silently, "This is the day, this is the day." My family respected my need for solitude, giving me the space to wait for my son. The silence was deafening, and the anticipation was painful as days turned into weeks without a word from him. My heart sank with each passing hour. Why hasn't he called? I wondered, feeling a mix of despair and frustration. The seed of doubt began to grow. Had something gone horribly wrong? I couldn't shake the feeling, and I knew I needed to take action. It was time to find answers. My anxiety grew, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I had spent sleepless nights replaying every possible scenario in my mind. Why would my son not contact me? The more I thought about it, the more it felt like a heavy weight on my chest. I needed answers and couldn't ignore this gnawing feeling any longer. It was time to do something about it. Later that month, I gathered the courage to reach out to the hospital where he was born. I remember the day vividly. The cool autumn air did little to calm my racing heart. What if they can't help? What if I never find him? I pushed those thoughts aside and dialed the number. My hands shook, but I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this time, I'd get the answers I needed. I wanted answers and needed to know why he hadn't contacted me. My voice trembled as I spoke to the receptionist. "Hi, I need information about an adoption that took place 18 years ago," I said. The receptionist paused, then asked for some details. I gave her everything I could remember, hoping it would be enough. Waiting for her response felt like an eternity, each second intensifying my fears. I was determined to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. I couldn't let this go any longer. "Please, this is really important to me," I added, trying to convey the urgency in my voice. The receptionist transferred me to another department. As I waited on hold, my determination grew stronger. I wouldn't let anyone brush me off or tell me to forget my son. I needed to know the truth. I called the hospital and requested information about the adoption, going through several transfers and holds. Each time, I repeated my story, feeling more frustrated as the minutes passed. "Can someone just help me?" I muttered under my breath. Finally, after nearly an hour, I was connected to an administrator. "I need to know about my son's adoption," I said firmly. "Please, it's been 18 years, and I deserve some answers." I finally spoke to a curt administrator who promised to call me back, but days passed without a word. Each day felt like an eternity as I checked my phone every few minutes, hoping for any news. The silence was maddening. Why aren't they calling? I wondered, growing more impatient. I felt like I was hitting a wall of bureaucracy, and my frustration mounted with each passing day. My patience wore thin, so I decided to visit the hospital in person. I couldn't sit idly by any longer. I packed my bag, determined to get some answers face to face. The drive to the hospital was a blur of thoughts and emotions. What would I say? Would they help me? I didn't know, but I had to try. As I walked through the hospital doors, I felt a surge of resolve. I marched into the records department, demanded to see my son's file, and was met with resistance. The clerk behind the desk looked at me skeptically. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we can't release that information," he said. "But I'm his mother," I countered, my voice tinged with desperation. The clerk sighed, shaking his head. "I understand, but there are privacy laws." His words felt like another roadblock, but I wasn't about to give up. They cited confidentiality laws, but I wasn't about to give up. "There has to be a way," I insisted, leaning forward. "I just need to know what happened to him." The clerk looked around nervously before whispering, "We can't bend the rules, ma'am." Frustrated, I took a step back, contemplating my next move. I knew I had hit a legal wall, but I was more determined than ever to find a way through it. I demanded to speak with the doctor who handled the adoption, determined to get some answers. "I need to talk to Dr. Stevens," I said firmly. The clerk hesitated, then made a call. As I waited, I felt a mix of anger and hope. Finally, the clerk nodded. "Dr. Stevens will see you now," he said. I followed him down the corridor, heart pounding, ready to do whatever it took to find my son. After persistent requests, I managed to track down Dr. Stevens, the doctor who had overseen the adoption. It felt like a small victory in my relentless quest for answers. I knew that speaking to her could either open a door to the truth or slam it shut for good. My determination was unwavering. I needed to face the person who had a hand in taking my son from me. Dr. Stevens looked stressed and weary as she reluctantly agreed to meet with me. Her face had aged since the day she handled my son's adoption, etched with lines of fatigue and worry. As we sat across from each other, her eyes avoided mine. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," I began, trying to keep my voice steady despite the mix of emotions swirling inside me. As we sat in her cluttered office, she appeared evasive and hesitant, asking me to understand that many years had passed. "You must realize, records may not be complete," she said, her tone cautious. Papers were scattered everywhere, old files and folders creating an almost suffocating atmosphere. "I understand, but I need any information you can give me," I urged, trying to convey my desperation. Despite her cautious words, I couldn't ignore the sense of dread building within me. Something in her demeanor suggested she knew more than she was letting on. "Is there something you're not telling me?" I asked, watching her closely. Dr. Stevens shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the mess on her desk as if searching for an escape. The silence between us grew heavy, adding to my growing unease. She finally balled up her courage and promised to help me find the answers I needed. "I'll do my best to assist you," she said, meeting my eyes for the first time. "But you have to understand, it may take some time." I nodded, grateful for her willingness to help. "Thank you, Dr. Stevens. That's all I've been asking for," I said quietly, feeling a glimmer of hope. I knew I couldn't rest until I knew everything about my son's adoption. Each moment spent waiting felt like a lifetime. "Can we start now?" I asked impatiently. Dr. Stevens took a deep breath and nodded. "Let's see what we can find," she said, turning to her computer. As she typed, I clutched my hands together, trying to steady my nerves. This was the moment I had been waiting for. With Dr. Stevens' assistance, I managed to gain access to some old records. The files were dusty and worn, showing their age. Dr. Stevens handed me a stack, and I felt a rush of anticipation mixed with fear. "These are from the time frame you mentioned," she said. I took a deep breath and began to sift through the documents, hoping to find any lead about my son. Flipping through the faded documents, I searched for any clues about my son's whereabouts. Each page brought me closer to the truth, or so I hoped. The details were dry and clinical, listings of dates, names, and bureaucratic jargon. I scanned for something, anything, that might point me in the right direction. My heart pounded as I turned each page, fearing and longing for what I might find. Most of the information was routine, but then I stumbled upon something odd. A particular document caught my eye, the ink faded but legible. The date seemed off, and the signatures looked strange. "Dr. Stevens, can you look at this?" I asked, holding up the paper. She leaned over, her brow furrowing as she examined the document. "This doesn't look right," she admitted, her voice tinged with concern. There were discrepancies in the timeline and inconsistencies in the adoption paperwork. The dates didn't match up, and some of the signatures seemed off. "How could this happen?" I asked, feeling a mix of anger and confusion. Dr. Stevens shook her head. "I don't know, but we need to investigate further," she said. My heart pounded with a renewed sense of urgency. Something was definitely wrong. The dates didn't match, and some signatures seemed off. I started to feel a sinking sensation in my stomach. "What does this mean?" I asked, holding the documents tighter. Dr. Stevens adjusted her glasses and frowned, staring at the inconsistencies. "It's highly irregular," she muttered. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. The more I examined the papers, the more convinced I became that something had gone terribly wrong. My heart pounded as I realized something might have gone terribly wrong during the adoption process. I couldn't shake the feeling that these discrepancies were more than just clerical errors. "We need to look deeper," I pressed, my voice rising with urgency. Dr. Stevens nodded. "I agree. This needs thorough investigation," she said. A whirlwind of emotions swirled inside me, driving my determination to uncover the truth about my son. Determined to investigate further, I hired a private investigator named Mark. I wasn't willing to leave any stone unturned. Mark came highly recommended, a man known for his skill in uncovering hidden truths. I met him at a small office downtown, laying out the documents and explaining my situation. "I need your help to find my son," I said, my voice steady despite my inner turmoil. He nodded, ready to take on the challenge. Mark was a seasoned professional with a knack for uncovering hidden truths. His calm demeanor and methodical approach reassured me. "I'll start by going through these documents and cross-referencing them with available records," he explained. His confidence was infectious, making me feel like I had finally found a valuable ally. "Thank you, Mark. I appreciate your help more than you know," I said. He simply nodded, focused on the task at hand. Together, we pored over the documents and soon discovered other anomalies. Dates that didn't line up, signatures that looked forged, and other odd details began to stand out. "This isn't just a mistake," Mark remarked, tapping on a particularly suspicious page. "There's something deeper here." I felt like we were peeling back layers of a vast hidden truth. The more we uncovered, the more determined I became to get to the bottom of it. Several names and addresses were redacted, adding to the suspicion. Why would they hide this information? I wondered aloud. Mark arched an eyebrow. "Confidentiality laws, perhaps, but it's also a way to keep things buried," he said. He pointed at the blacked out lines with frustration. "We need to find out who's behind this." These redactions felt like deliberate attempts to obstruct our search. I knew we had to dig deeper, no matter the obstacles. Mark suggested we visit some of the addresses listed, hoping they might lead us to someone who knew what happened. I agreed, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Our plan was simple: gather as much information as we could from anyone who might remember my son's case. "It's a long shot, but we might get lucky," Mark said. With a list of partially unredacted addresses in hand, we set out to find answers. Our first few attempts were fruitless, but we pressed on. Many addresses led to dead ends, vacant lots, closed businesses, indifferent residents with no recollection. Each failure felt like a punch to the gut, but neither Mark nor I were ready to give up. "We just need one good lead," I told him, trying to stay optimistic. Mark nodded, determination in his eyes. "One lead can change everything," he agreed. We continued, undeterred. One day Mark called with a lead. He had tracked down a former nurse who worked at the hospital during the time. "Her name is Claire, and she's willing to talk," Mark said. My heart leapt at the news. "When can we meet her?" I asked, barely containing my excitement. "She agreed to a meeting tomorrow at a cafe downtown," Mark replied. It felt like a breakthrough, and I couldn't wait for the meeting. Nurse Claire agreed to meet us in a quiet cafe where she nervously shared her memories. Her hands trembled as she sipped her coffee. "I remember your case," she began. "There were some things that never sat right with me." Her voice wavered as she described irregularities she had noticed. Conversations about special adoptions bypassing the usual processes, she revealed. My blood ran cold. "What kind of irregularities?" I pressed, needing to know more. She recalled a particular case of a teenage mother forced to give up her baby, hinting at irregularities she had noticed. Claire leaned in closer, her brow creased with concern. There were whispers in the halls, she said, about how some adoptions weren't as straightforward as they seemed. My heart raced as I listened, eager to hear more. Could this be the thread I needed to unravel the truth? Claire mentioned overhearing conversations about special adoptions that bypass the usual processes. Her voice grew quieter, almost a whisper. I remember hearing about certain babies being handled differently, she confessed. There were informal meetings, and some documents were never processed through official channels. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but it painted a disturbing picture. I leaned in, urging her to continue. Who was involved in these adoptions? My blood ran cold as she described arrangements handled by an external organization. It seemed like there was a separate group managing these adoptions under the radar, Claire explained. Her eyes darted around the cafe, as if expecting someone to overhear. They weren't part of the hospital staff, but they had access to the records. I clenched my fists under the table. Do you remember any names or details? I asked, feeling a surge of determination. With this new information, Mark and I delved deeper into the hospital's adoption practices. We spent endless hours combing through documents, trying to track down this external organization. There has to be a paper trail, Mark muttered, frustration evident in his voice. We contacted former employees, scoured public records, and even reached out to legal experts. The more we investigated, the clearer it became that this wasn't an isolated incident. The scope of it all was terrifying. We uncovered a string of similar cases where young mothers were coerced into giving up their babies under dubious circumstances. This goes way beyond just your case, Mark said solemnly, spreading out the files in front of us. Each one told a heartbreaking story of manipulation and deceit. Look at this one, he pointed. Same hospital, same irregularities. My anger grew with each story we read. We knew these weren't just coincidences. Something much bigger was at play. It became clear that my son's adoption was part of a larger, more sinister scheme. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This isn't just about finding my son anymore, I said to Mark, my voice trembling with resolve. We need to expose this. Mark nodded in agreement. We have enough evidence to make a strong case, he said. The plan was no longer just to find my son, but to bring justice to all affected. Armed with evidence, I decided to take legal action against the hospital. We have to hold them accountable for what they've done, I told Mark and my family. With their support, I contacted a lawyer specializing in medical malpractice and adoption fraud. This hospital has a lot to answer for, the lawyer said, reviewing our evidence. We'll file a lawsuit and demand a thorough investigation. I felt a surge of determination, ready to fight for the truth. I filed a lawsuit, determined to uncover the truth and hold those responsible accountable. The legal proceedings would be long and grueling, but I was prepared to endure it all. This isn't just about me, I said at the press conference, my voice steady. It's about every mother and child who's been wronged by this system. The media picked up the story, and soon other parents came forward with similar tales. The hospital was finally under scrutiny. During the trial, shocking revelations came to light. Witness after witness took the stand, each testimony adding weight to our case. Former employees spoke of forged documents, bribes, and illegal arrangements. I saw it with my own eyes, one nurse confessed, babies being taken without proper consent. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the extent of the hospital's malpractice became evident. My heart ached with each revelation, but my determination only grew stronger. The hospital had been involved in a black market adoption ring, selling babies to the highest bidder. The evidence was overwhelming, and the courtroom fell silent as it was presented. I felt a mix of anger and relief. The truth was finally out. Your son was part of this scheme, the lawyer said, her voice heavy with empathy. My mind reeled. How could they do this? My fight was far from over, but I knew I was on the right path. My son had been taken by one such organization and placed in a fraudulent adoption. I was horrified to learn that his adoption had been handled through illegal means, and he had been sold without my consent. The realization that my son had been a victim of this horrendous scheme made my blood boil. I was determined more than ever to find him and bring those responsible to justice. The fight was far from over. The news hit me like a ton of bricks, and I broke down in the courtroom. My legs gave way, and I collapsed into my chair, sobbing uncontrollably. It felt like my heart had been ripped out of my chest. My family rushed to my side, but their comforting words couldn't dull the pain. The image of my newborn baby being taken away from me replayed in my mind, a cruel reminder of the nightmare I had lived through. Despite my devastation, I persisted in my fight for justice, driven by the need to find my son. I couldn't let this terrible injustice go unpunished. Every tear, every sob fueled my resolve. "I will find you," I whispered to myself, a promise to my lost child. With my family's support, I prepared for the grueling legal battle ahead. My lawyer reassured me, "We have a strong case, and we won't stop until we find him." Finally, after months of legal battles, shocking evidence emerged. We had gathered substantial proof showing the hospital's involvement in the black market adoption ring. The courtroom was abuzz with revelations, each one more damning than the last. My lawyer stood beside me, her face a mask of determination. "We're getting closer," she said. Our persistence was paying off, and it felt like we were steps away from uncovering the truth about my son's whereabouts. My son had been placed with a wealthy but corrupt businessman who had kept him hidden all these years. The revelation was staggering. This man had shielded my son from the world, denying him the chance to know his real mother. My lawyer presented the evidence in court, and the judge's face hardened with anger. "This will not go unpunished," the judge declared. My heart ached with the knowledge of what my son had endured. The truth was almost too painful to bear, but I knew I had to reunite with my son. My resolve grew stronger with each passing day. I wouldn't let this corrupt businessman win. With the court's aid, I managed to track down the businessman and confront him fiercely. Our confrontation was intense, emotions running high on both sides. I demanded to see my son, my voice unwavering despite the turmoil inside me. With the court's aid, I managed to track down the businessman and confront him fiercely. "You had no right to keep my son," I shouted, my eyes blazing with fury. The businessman tried to defend his actions, but each weak excuse made my resolve stronger. "You will pay for this," I promised him. The lawyers intervened, and arrangements were made for a reunion. My heart pounded with anticipation, knowing that the moment I had dreamed of was near. After intense and emotional discussions, arrangements were made for a reunion. The legal teams finalized the details, and the date was set. I spent the days leading up to it in a whirlwind of emotions, torn between joy and anxiety. Would he recognize me? Would he want to know me? Despite my fears, I held on to the hope that our bond would be unbreakable. "This is really happening," I whispered, hardly daring to believe it. The moment I held my son again, tears flowed freely, and the years of pain began to heal. He looked at me with wide eyes, both curious and wary. "Mom," he whispered, his voice tinged with hope and disbelief. "Yes, it's me," I said, my voice choked with emotion. His arms wrapped around me, and we both cried, the long years of separation melting away in that embrace. We were finally together, and it was everything I had ever dreamed of. Though the journey had been long and painful, there was finally closure and a chance to build a future together. We spent hours talking, sharing stories, and catching up on lost time. My family welcomed him with open arms, and he fit right in as if he had always been there. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but we faced it together. For the first time in 18 years, my heart felt whole.
You like this touching and surprising story? If so, we invite you to leave us a comment expressing your opinion. If you want to continue enjoying inspiring stories like this one, subscribe to our channel or check out the other videos shown at the bottom of the screen. Thank you for your cooperation.